Hello. Welcome to Political Realignment. I'm Hank Wilson. I'd like to begin with a simple question. How do you rebuild a nation after it has been divided against itself? Well, it's a question every generation hopes it will never have to answer. Yet, in the spring of 1865, Americans found themselves facing exactly that challenge. After 4 long years of conflict, the fighting had ended, the Union had been preserved, slavery had been abolished, and millions of Americans looked forward to a future with hope. But peace didn't erase the problems the war had created. In many ways, the nation's hardest work was only beginning. The southern states had suffered tremendous destruction. Railroads, bridges, farms, businesses, and entire communities had been devastated. Families on both sides of the conflict mourned loved ones who would never return home. At the same time, nearly 4 million formerly enslaved men, women, and children were now legally free, beginning lives unlike anything they or the nation had experienced before. So one enormous question stood before the country. What should the United States now become? Should the former Confederate States simply return to the Union as if nothing had happened? Should they be required to meet certain conditions before regaining full representation in Congress? What rights should formerly enslaved Americans possess? Who should or could protect those rights? And perhaps the largest constitutional question of all, should individual states decide these issues for themselves, or should the federal government establish national standards? Now, these weren't simply political disagreements. They were constitutional questions that would shape American government for generations. President Lincoln had begun considering these questions before the war ended. His hope was to restore the Union as quickly as possible while encouraging reconciliation between the North and the South. Well, tragically, only 5 days after General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, President Lincoln was assassinated. Vice President Andrew Johnson suddenly found himself responsible for leading a wounded nation through one of the most difficult periods in American history. No one had ever attempted to reunite a nation after a civil war. There was no instruction manual. Congress and the president, they often disagreed about the best path forward. Some believed the southern states should regain self-government quickly. Others feared that moving too fast would allow many of the same political leaders and systems that had existed before the war to return to power. Meanwhile, millions of newly freed Americans were asking a fundamental question. What did freedom actually mean? Was it simply the absence of slavery? Or did freedom also include citizenship, voting, education, equal treatment under the law, and the opportunity to fully participate in American society? Those questions would become the heart of one of the most ambitious periods of constitutional change in our nation's history. Over the next 12 years, Congress would pass new constitutional amendments, reorganize Southern governments, station federal troops throughout much of the South, and attempt to redefine the relationship between the federal government, the states, and individual citizens. The period became known as Reconstruction. Some Americans viewed Reconstruction as a necessary effort to fulfill the promises made at the end of the war. Others viewed it as an unprecedented expansion of federal authority into matters that had traditionally been handled by the states. Those competing visions of government would not disappear when Reconstruction ended. Instead, they would echo through courtrooms, legislatures, elections, and political parties for the next century and beyond. That's why this period matters. When many people think about the political changes of the 60s or the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, they often treat those events as though they appeared suddenly. They didn't. Like most important moments in history, they were built upon decades of earlier decisions. If we want to understand, truly understand, how America's political landscape changed, we first have to understand the constitutional questions that emerged after the war ended. Those questions became the first domino. Thank you for joining me for this first episode of Political Realignment. Next time, we'll begin exploring the period known as Reconstruction. We'll examine why Congress believed new constitutional amendments were necessary, why President Andrew Johnson often found himself at odds with Congress, and how two very, very, very different visions for rebuilding America began to emerge. Because although the guns had fallen silent, the debate over the future of the United States had only just begun. Until next time, I'm Hank Wilson. Thank you for listening.